Do you like to feel like you're always chasing your tail? That you're always trying to catch up? That there's always 100 things that have to be done at the end of the day that aren't done? And then you find sometimes that maybe you don't sleep well because you're thinking about all those things? And we could go on with other ways of illustrating this, but part of that problem involves the world system. And we're going to look at that today as we continue going verse by verse through 1 John chapter 2. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher, and we left off yesterday in 1 John chapter 2. We looked at verses 15 and 16, where John, I believe, is talking to the young men from the end of verse 14. And while the young men know how to be strong, they know how to deal with their sin nature, and they know how to deal with Satan, they're struggling with this third enemy, the world system. And he says, don't love the world. And I maybe have gone over this before, but this expression over here, me agapeta, can be taken two ways. Number one, it can be don't love or don't start loving the world. Don't start loving. Or it can mean stop loving if you are. It kind of depends on where you are. When you hear this charge in Greek, it just depends on if you're loving it, cut it out. If you're not loving it, don't start. Okay? So as John is writing to these young men, I think, and probably for a number of them, he's probably saying, stop loving the world. You are loving the world, and you're loving the things that are in the world. And we talked about what those things are yesterday. Has to do with lust for the flesh. And I've always pictured it as things that made your flesh comfortable, things that were appealing to the flesh in terms of all the things that we think that we have to have. But the other part of the flesh I think sometimes we leave out is the ability to boast and to argue and to be selfishly ambitious, looking out for ourselves. In that same way with the lust of the eyes, we're interested in those things that look good, not just in our personal physical physique and our hairstyle and such, but also in the things we are accomplishing, that they look good. And the last one is this boastful pride of life, this ability to make claims on behalf of something, like claiming a product will do all these things that it's not going to do any of those things. But we can go on and tell you all the things that it's going to do, like a snake oil salesman. He says, these aren't from the Father, they're from the world. So all of these kinds of things that we're doing down here. And I think as an example of this in the boastful pride of life, let me give you an example here in the world system that I think Christians get involved in, and they don't realize that it's part of this boastful pride of life. And I grew up around this, where you would have churches that would compete with each other to see how many people they could get to come to church or how many people they could get saved. How many baptisms did you get this month? I still remember reading an article in a religious newspaper that used to be sent to me. I think somebody still sends it, but it doesn't leave the post office. It ends up in the trash can. But one of the pastors there, a pastor from out in the Midwest, I believe it was, said he didn't think anybody had ever broken Peter's record for the most baptisms in one day. And so they set out to break Peter's record for the most baptisms in one day, 3,000 people. And I'm thinking, I don't know that Peter was counting it a record. I don't know that Peter set out to try to baptize 3,000 people. But this, pardon me, foolish pastor looked at it like it was a record to be broken. And you know what? The thing is why that's a boastful pride of life, especially if we're talking about salvation, is in the end, you don't get anybody saved. The only thing you do is that you are faithful to present the good news. In reality, God saves them in response to their hearing the good news and believing. And you cannot, by your efforts and your persuasion, get anybody to believe. So claiming that we had this many conversions this month is an empty, boastful pride, because you really can't take credit for what God does. You really can't in that regard. And I think that that's an important thing for us to think of, but because there are a lot of Christians who do this. And I think in the context, they're trying to think, how can we get people Look at how many people we're getting. We're getting this many people to attend our seminar or our Bible studies or whatever it is in comparison to those antichrists. They're competing with these unbelievers, and that's not something worth making empty, boastful claims in. All of this then comes down to a statement that John makes at the end of this in verse 17. He says, the world is passing away. Now, this was true in John's day, which is almost 2,000 years ago. But it's also, as he's saying this, the other aspect of it is that it's always passing away. And part of that always passing away can be not just that it's on its way out, but also to understand it that the world is always changing. The world's always changing. And if you as a Christian are going to try to do God's work according to the standards that the world sets, you're always going to be trying to do catch up. You're going to be chasing your tail or chasing the tail of the world constantly. And about the time you figure out what the way the world's doing it and how they say you need to do ministry, guess what? It's going to change, and you're going to be switching it up, and you're going to have to do it another way. And so therefore, when a believer is loving the world, it is an endless pursuit of trying to keep up with the world and its standards. What a waste. And I honestly think when I look at the world system, I really think it's something that Satan uses, has organized, for the sake of believers. It's more than for believers. It also has to do with what he's doing opposing God with unsaved people and unsaved or unbelieving or unrighteous, spirit beings. But he uses the world system to distract us. It gets us distracted from the things God really wants us to be about. What we should be about is loving others. And so John says the world's passing away, and its lusts, the things that people crave after and chase after. Well, yeah, I think it's always going to be lust for the flesh and the eyes and the empty boast of life. But what we boast about those things are constantly changing. Do you know that there was a time in the past that people actually wanted to be fat and overweight? Yeah, they wanted to be. Because you know what it said? It said, I am wealthy enough that I can have lots of food and I can eat food. And thin and skinny people normally were people that didn't have enough wherewithal and they didn't get to eat enough. Now we live in a culture that we look down on. Our culture looks down on people that we think are overweight. And we pride ourselves on being fit and trim and exercising. And boy, I tell you, and I'm a person that my wife would tell you makes a habit of exercising, sometimes to the point that I become obsessed, and I can put that exercise ahead of serving others. I've been in that situation, and I've had to correct my way of thinking and saying loving others is more important. That doesn't mean we can't exercise or try to take care of ourselves, but I don't know that that's either here nor there. In fact, I think Paul's statement, where he makes a statement in writing to Timothy, and he says bodily exercise is of a little value. I don't think he's talking about literal physical bodily exercise. I believe he's using that with regard to kind of what people would call spiritual disciplines, religious activities that people go through that put themselves through certain rigors, fasting and things like that. He says there's just a little value of that. But the real value is you exercise yourself unto a lifestyle that honors God. So John says this world's passing away and its cravings. Like we said, maybe today we all want to be heavy, tomorrow we all want to be thin. Then give it a little while, we all want to be somewhere in the middle. I don't know. We all want to have a head of hair, now we all want to shave it off. Styles and things change. And he says that is all that's passing away. But the one who does the will of God, now the New American Standard says lives forever. And this is not the word live. It's not any form of a word live. It's the word meno. And the word meno means to abide or to be at ease. And literally, and it's not even just forever, it's literally into the age, which a lot of Bible translators are going to say into the age means forever. I don't think it means forever. I honestly think it's a way that they expressed looking into the age that's coming. And there's an age that's coming. Because sometimes it's into ages of ages or ages coming from ages. That's a whole other Bible study. But this is John's point here at the end of verse 17. The one that does God's will, that one is at ease into the age. As this age goes on and moves out there, and the things of the world around us are changing and they're in flux, and today it's this and tomorrow it's that, and we're always trying to keep up and be relevant, and in the midst of all that, we aren't at ease because we're constantly, our stomach's in a knot, wondering if we're keeping up and if we're doing all the things that we should be doing to be, well, whatever the world tells us we should be. So what does he mean when the one who does the will of God? Well, I kind of think we've hit it already here in this letter, but it really goes back to the opposite of this. The opposite of loving the world would be loving other believers, loving your brothers and sisters in Christ, laying down your life for them, engaging with them, serving them in love. And he says the one who is doing the will of God, and I believe that that's what this is going to refer to. You're doing the will of God because you're loving other believers. Some people are going to look at this and they go, well, isn't evangelism God's top will? I don't even think evangelism is God's top will. The command that he left with us is to love one another like he loved us. That's the command that he left with the disciples in John 13, looking forward to the establishment of the church. And so that's really what we should be about. And then you come down here to the end of this, and this expression lives forever is he abides, or he is at ease into the age. When all of this is in flux and it's constantly changing, you're just okay. You're fine. You're at ease. You're at ease in the midst of the chaos and the change and everything being different from one year to the next or one day to the next, because you're doing God's will. God's will is love for others, and love never goes out of style. You don't have to take, well, this was love today, but now it's not, so I'm going to take it to Goodwill along with a sack of other things of love. No, love never goes out of style. It's always appropriate. You may show that love in different ways, granted, but I don't even think you're letting the world really dictate, because what it comes down to is people need care. They need your time. They need to listen to you. They need you to listen to them. Or sometimes they need to be with you so they can hear you too. They need food and clothing. John's going to address that in chapter 3. They need fellowship. They need to minister their gift just like you need to minister yours. They need to be with other believers. They need to be interacting and growing together in the body of Christ. And if you have believers who are struggling, like the Paideia, these young learners, guess the way you show love to them? You sit down and say, hey, let's talk about who Jesus is. Who is Jesus? Come on, you tell me. You know. Because John's going to say that. And they could tell you who Jesus is. And tell me, what did Jesus do? Okay, good. And what do you think about sin? Yeah, it's a problem. Christ dealt with it, but yeah, it's so. Now those antichrists, what were they saying? That's right. So were they with us or were they not with us? No, that's right. They weren't with us. I'm trying to give an illustration of how a person might love another believer, is to help a believer that's struggling with the thing and walk them through their problem. Ask them some questions and let them think with what they've learned. Let them think and walk through this problem. That's what John's going to do in the following verses with regard to Antichrist. But that's our next study. So, stop and think about this. Are you loving the world system? Are you letting it distract you? Are you constantly pursuing and chasing after everything the world has to have you do as an individual within the world, or also as a Christian trying to do God's work? Are you constantly trying to do God's work the way the world is trying to dictate to us the way we should accomplish God's work, the way things should happen? Is that the way you're doing it? Or are you just, with your time, with the resources that God's provided you, are you just taking the time to do the will of God with those believers God puts in your path? I can't minister to all believers, but there are believers He puts in my path, and I can take time with them as He brings them to me, or brings me to them, whatever it might be. There we go. Something to think about with regard to the world system in God's will for us. And those things, we're only going to do this as we're having a good day in the Lord relating to who we are there. And so I thank you, as I do every day, and I do mean this sincerely. Thank you for joining me.